Hey folks, and welcome to the R&D Diesel channel. Today we're going to be replacing the cylinder head oil rail end plugs on my 1997 Ford F350. Now this is going to be an identical process for any of your 1994 and a half through 1997 Ford trucks equipped with the 7.3 Powerstroke. And a lot of this does also apply for your Super Duty trucks from 99 through 2003. But of course it's going to be a little bit different since there's different components, different layout in the engine bay of those guys, but the basic process is going to be similar. So today we're going to be trying to do this without removing the engine, and we'll see how that goes. But I'll show you guys what basically the problem is. So there's effectively a really bad oil leak on this thing that popped up, and you can see that there's oil that's just dribbling down all underneath the truck, really horrible. And I traced it down to the oil rail end plugs. So the oil rail end plug specifically that appears to be leaking in my case is the passenger side front one. You can see it right there hidden behind the alternator, and there's just a bit of oil around it. Now there's actually 4 of these guys on the engine. There's 2 in the front and then 2 in the back here as well by the firewall. The accessibility on them is pretty terrible, but we're gonna remove some components, get the alternator and all that stuff out of the way to access these guys. Now there is a old and new design on these plugs, so somewhere along the way they actually updated the design and moved the sealing surface a little bit further into the cylinder head from my understanding. So what I would recommend doing is, and this is what I'm doing, is I'm actually just buying a whole new cylinder head end plugs, and this has the updated design on it. I don't think you could probably get the old ones to work, but frankly if they've got a newer, better design out there, it probably makes sense to go ahead and get those. They're not too expensive, like $16.45 from the dealership, and so you need 4 of them, so it comes up to be a little like 60 bucks. Now full disclosure, this video is pretty long and drawn out, so I wanted to explain to you guys real quick that I've done my best to break this video apart into chapters. I've put the timestamps down in the description below, but in general, the first part of this video covers the passenger side front rail end plug, and I show that guy in full detail, kind of going through like the whole process of cleaning it, adding in the Loctite, all that stuff. Then also go into, after that, passenger side valve cover removal, and then also some details on removing the passenger side rear oil plug, and all that stuff on the passenger side is covered in really high level detail, trying to show you pretty much everything that's involved with that. Now I do also cover some details on the passenger side here in the video, but I pretty much only give you a high level overview of what's involved and kind of give you a couple pointers here and there about what all was involved in the process. My intention is that if you want to see how the process is done to replace the oil rail end plugs, you'll watch the first part of the video, which is the passenger side, but I of course will put the timestamps so you guys can have the choice. Now note, in this video I did also remove the passenger side valve cover and the driver's side valve cover. This isn't strictly necessary. I only do that in this case because there are some additional seals inside on the oil rail drain plugs that I wanted to get at and replace them while I was going through this whole process. Alright, I've got the batteries disconnected just to make sure I don't do anything silly like try to start the truck or electrocute myself. Now for starters, my truck does have an aftermarket intercooler system I installed, so I'm going to go ahead and start off by removing the intercooler pipe on the passenger side. And I'm going to start by doing the passenger side just because this is the one that's definitely leaking. And of course, if your truck is stock, you're not going to worry about this intercooler piping, so little things will be different here. Now to access this front oil rail end plug, I'm going to remove this sort of like accessory structure that holds all the belts and tensioners and holds the alternator on. Now I'm seeing that there are 4 bolts. There's one here, 2, third one hidden down there behind the tensioner, and then a 4th one down below this idler. And to start off, I'm going to go ahead and remove the serpentine belt, and I think I'll also go ahead and remove the alternator as well, just to make it a little bit lighter and easier to see everything there. I got a 15mm socket here on a breaker bar, and I'm going to put this on the tensioner and then pull back to loosen it up and then freeze up that serpentine belt. All right, I got a 13mm socket here. I'm going to go ahead and pull off the alternator, at least break these bolts loose. All right, there's a couple of electrical connectors on the alternator as well. So got this little screwdriver. Use that to pry back on this electrical connection and then pull it out. There's also a little clip here. Just pushes in, pops out. And then this is where it's important, of course, to have the battery disconnected, because there is another connection on the back of the alternator here that I'm going to have to remove. And this actually does otherwise have 12 volts on it. So you definitely don't want to short it out. All right, 10mm socket. Gonna go ahead and just remove this cable. And I'm gonna reinstall that nut so I don't lose it. I'm gonna go ahead and finish removing these alternator bolts. And there we go. I got a 13mm socket to break loose these bolts. Now access to one of these bolts is blocked by this tensioner here, and so I'm going to go ahead and remove the tensioner. Got a T50 Torx bit. Put that in there. Okay, got the tensioner bolt loosened. It is a normal right hand thread, so righty tighty, lefty loosey. Alright, got that accessory cover removed, and now you can see the whole area much easier. There's the oil rail end plug that's leaking, and you can see actually some pretty clean spots underneath here, probably washed off by all the oil. I'm going to go ahead and just give this whole area a little bit of a light cleaning with some brake parts cleaner. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and bust loose the front oil rail plug. Actually didn't really take much for that. I'm not going to completely remove it and just breaking it loose, because we'll go ahead and remove this valve cover so we can drain the oil rail and not get oil all over the ground. Alright, next thing on the docket is to go ahead and remove this valve cover. I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the nut here for the clamp for this absolute air pressure sensor. Set that to the side. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can push away some of this insulation here. I'm going to disconnect this little vacuum line so we can get to the valve cover. Push that insulation kind of down and out. You got a 5/16 here. Use that to remove this vacuum reservoir. I'm sure there's probably an actual metric size, but this works. Okay, and that just pops out of there. I set it aside. Actually, looks like there's supposed to be another one down here that holds the reservoir in place, but mine, of course, is missing. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and remove this dipstick. This is step 2. 10mm socket here. All right, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and remove this series of screws or bolts that go all the way around the perimeter. Pull the valve cover on. All right, before I break into this guy, I'm going to go ahead and use some compressed air to spray off all the areas around here and get as much dirt out of the way as possible to help minimize the risk of us getting dirt into the engine. Swivel bit here should help us remove some of these guys. And 13mm deep well for other spots can't reach. Now to access the bolts in the very back here, really the easiest thing to do for this, well, I'm not saying anything about it, it's easy, but using a little 1/4" drive ratchet with a 13mm socket on it, you're able to just kind of barely sneak it back behind here to grab the last bolt in the very back. You can't really see it, and it's actually a little bit more difficult than the other side, but this side is still pretty nightmarish. But just by going on feel, you can mostly find it. There we go. Those two guys out. Yeah, let's note that there's actually some studs here that hold, so there's actually a couple extra ones you have to pull in the middle that hold the wheel dipstick holder on. Some studs here. Just pull this guy off. All right, now to gain access to these drain plugs that are right here, another one over there, pop off these injector connectors. Then remove this valve cover gasket. There it is. All right, so now there's this little drain plug right here. Gone ahead and broken it loose using a 1/8 inch little Allen. I'm gonna go ahead and remove it all the way. And these are also some of the seals that I want to go ahead and replace here today while we're here, because these guys are also likely to be very old and they could be leaking as well. There we go, now we're getting some oil draining out. All right, now on these little itty bitty oil drain plugs, what I'm doing is I'm going to go ahead and replace the O-rings that are on them just as a kind of an extra safe measure. But yeah, this is also another place where we are likely to get a leak. So it's underneath the valve cover. I'm not going to be able to see it, and that's why I want to go ahead and replace these guys, is so that I at least have the assurance that it's going to be good to go. And I'll have you guys note a couple things to be particular about with your O-rings, and that is the materials. But in general, if you're using an O-ring, my recommendation is that you use Viton. Usually they are more brown in color. Now the Viton is really nice because it actually technically has an infinite shelf life in comparison to the Buna. Buna has about a 5-year shelf life and it will break down in time and you'll be unable to use it. So the Viton will last much longer, so I recommend you use it, and it's also more chemical resistant. Ooh. Yeah, that guy's definitely brittle, falling apart. Now, full disclosure, the source of Viton O-rings I got is I actually got this Viton O-ring assortment from Harbor Freight. Yes, Harbor Freight. And I'm specifically using this A010 size O-ring, which is what I found that appears to be the exact same size as the original one was. All right, well, the oil rail's been draining out for a while. I think it's pretty empty, but I'm going to go ahead and see if I can use some compressed air to encourage more of it to come out. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and pull off this front oil galley plug, the one that's been leaking on me. And I'm just going to use my 1/2 inch drive socket. And again, I already broke this loose earlier, as you guys saw. And preference in my head is to, break these things loose before you have the valve cover off. Just that way you minimize you're not gonna hit something and throw a bunch of dirt inside. Try to keep it clean as we can. I've got a drain pan underneath here and some cardboard for the event that this thing leaks like crazy, which it probably will. There's a really crisp nick in there that is definitely not going to seal at all. Yeah, so inside here it's really nasty and dirty, so I'll do my best to clean it out. And we actually need to have this thing be very clean for whenever we go to reinstall the new one. And that's done because we're going to actually put some thread locker on here. And again, one of the things you'll make note of is that the O-ring seals differently than like a gasket, because whenever we go to reinstall this guy, we actually only torque it to about 60 foot-pounds, which if you think about it, we're basically pushing against this thread right here. And this is what, like an 1.5 inch thread, something pretty darn big like that. And I would expect that if you were to put full torque on this, it would be probably on the order of I don't know, I'd say at least a couple 100 foot-pounds if you were to use this thing for a gasket application. But in this case, the O-ring really doesn't need all that much preload. It really doesn't need any preload to actually seal. It actually just pops inside of this machine smooth surface in here. And as long as this plug doesn't pop out, it's going to seal just fine. And provided the O-ring is squishy enough that it can fill any voids so this doesn't leak. And so really, that's why it's very important that we apply Loctite on this thing. It's because torquing this thing to 60 foot-pounds really isn't enough to get significant preload on the joint for it to not back out and fall out. And so that's why the Loctite's so important. But the other thing about this that's very interesting is that this is a cast iron cylinder head. And so cast iron is pretty brittle. It's not super strong, so you can't really torque it too much. You can only really put so much preload on it before you worry about it breaking. So probably another reason why they decided to use the Loctite. All right, to clean this guy out, I'm going to take a brand new rag, and I've cleaned this thing out decently well this far, but I'm going to take a brand new rag, and I'm going to stuff it in there, and hopefully we can get that out later, but I'm going to do that so that I can use some brake cleaner to clean this guy out. I really don't want to get any brake cleaner in with the motor oil, so that could thin it out. Also got this little stainless steel brush I'm going to use to help clean out the threads. So this, I am note that I'm using a stainless steel brush in here. So I am making sure to only touch the threads. You don't want to mar up that sealing surface in there. Go ahead and pull this rag out, make sure we get it all out. A little wipe down. Alright, now this additional sanity measure here. Let's go ahead and inspect this guy and make sure the sealing surface looks pretty good. But you'll notice there's actually, two steps in here. There's a kind of an angled portion towards the front, and then there's a straight portion, and that's the straight portion that it actually seals on. The angle part is just going to be there to help squish and guide the O-ring into position. Make sure these guys are as clean as I can get it. This is the new one and the new O-ring. And to also make sure the O-ring is clean. And these appear to have some sort of like blue coating on them. Can't tell if that's like a dry film lubricant or not, but these are generally pretty flexible. There we go. Alright, got that guy installed. And of course you want to make sure it's not like rolled or anything like that. Definitely not be good. And I'm going to go ahead and apply a generous amount of Loctite on here. And then we'll install this guy. Alright, so I've applied some Loctite 277 on here. Go ahead and slide this guy in place. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have some issues with torquing the back side. So as a second guess, this is easy access, so I can feel this thing's like seated, and it feels pretty good. And like, it's just a little snug, but I haven't really torqued it. So I have my torque wrench here set to 60 foot-pounds per the instructions that came with the parts. And what I'm going to do is keep track of the degrees of rotation before this guy clicks. Really isn't that much torque at all. That's about a 10-degree angle right there. So that really wasn't much. So I'll keep that in mind because I'm not going to be able to truly torque the backside using the torque wrench just because the accessibility isn't there. But what we can do is use the same concept here. We'll seat the one in the back all the way, and then we'll rotate 10 degrees, and that's actually, technically speaking, a more accurate way of giving you a torque. Now, so the next challenge we're going to have is gaining access to this rear oil galley plug. So what I'm going to do is remove the exhaust. And the problem is that you're supposed to be able to get a 1/2-inch drive wrench in there, but of course the exhaust is in the way. So I'm going to disconnect it up top here first. 7/16 wrench. Alright, the guy's a little bit stuck, so screwdriver to help pry it apart. right, now we're going to go underneath the truck and see if we can get ourselves some more space by removing the bottom end of this downpipe. All right, we're underneath the truck now, looking at the exhaust flange. This here is the front of the truck. My finger's pointing. This is the exhaust downpipe that we were working on earlier. And I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it at this flange. There's two, looks like 15mm bolts that hold it on. Now, yours should be hopefully a little bit easier to access, unless you've done exhaust modifications like I've done, where this is a 4-inch exhaust that comes out from the downpipe. It makes it a complete pain in the posterior to remove these, so hopefully yours will be easier to access. The next thing I do is make a tool so that we can actually loosen up and tighten the oil plug that is on is nearest to the firewall. So what my plan to do is to use this little 3/8 to 1/2 inch drive adapter. So this 1/2 inch drive will interface with the oil galley plug, and then I'm going to bore out this nut and slide it into here to give us a tighter clearance, and then I'll weld the two together so that this will basically set in there, and I can loosen it just like a regular old nut, maybe use a bent wrench or something like that to get at it. So I've got this nice little milling machine. I'm going to use this to drill out the hole first. Now certainly you could just use a drill press or even a regular drill if you're desperate on this, but of course I'm going to use the tool that is easiest for me. So this guy's just a little bit large, so I'm going to go ahead and grind off a little bit on the outside, and I think that'll make it fit. I got to do that anyway so we can have a nice cut or a nice surface to weld on. Alright, so I got this guy in a vise, and then I have an angle grinder with this nice little like sander flap disc. These guys are really nice because it doesn't bounce as much and allows you to make a much more smoother and curved finish on here. All right, we'll go ahead and make sure this guy fits, and then if it does, we'll go ahead and weld it up and see how it works. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and use the same wrench I was using before and a tool to finish loosening up this rear plug. Before I do that, I'm going to reposition the oil pan, make sure I catch any oil leaks. Probably going to make a mess. Now this is where it's going to be interesting to try and clean this out while it's completely blind. Now I broke this little brush in half. It actually is giving me a little bit of access to this, so I can reach in there and do the best I can to clean those threads out. I will say one thing you got to be cautious of whenever you're working on the back is I need to make sure it's very clean so that the Loctite can actually grab onto the threads. If there's any oil there, that's going to mess with it. So what I found was best to do was to use a mirror like this and a flashlight, and you can actually look and see that oil gallery plug, and you can actually kind of see inside the oil gallery itself, and you'll actually be able to see there's quite a bit of gunk and stuff that gets into the threads. And so by going back and forth and using a very tiny brush and some brake cleaner, I was able to get it all cleaned out and everything. And of course it's not perfect, but I did the best I could. And you do have to work kind of quick because the oil tends to want to, even though we drain most of the oil out from the valve cover, a lot of the oil tends to want to like drain towards the back. And so really what I ended up doing was just kind of letting it drain out for probably a couple hours, and that helped it out a little bit. But then I had to stuff a rag in there And then right before we installed the plug, pulled the rag out and quickly shoved the oil plug in there. And it's got that O-ring in the very front, and so as long as that is pushing against the oil and sealing like it's supposed to, because it's a brand new seal, then that will keep the oil from getting to the threads. I'm going to carefully set this back in here as clean as I could and thread it in. And now, best I can to apply the torque preload that it needs. Okay, that's probably good. All right, well, now at this point, go ahead and reassemble everything here and get the gasket surfaces all cleaned off and put the truck back together. I'm gonna make sure I put these oil plugs back in as well. Now, one thing to note is I'm going to reassemble this truck, and we're going to wait as long as we possibly can to fire this thing up, because the Loctite actually is supposed to take 24 hours to completely set, and we don't want to put any oil on it or try to push the limits of it before it's ready. So perfectly, you want to wait at least 24 hours for the stuff to fully cure before you fire up the truck. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and start tackling the driver's side. I'm gonna see if we can remove the oil gallery plugs and replace those guys. I still have the serpentine belt loosened up, battery still connected and all that. For starters, what I'm gonna do is I've already pulled off my air intake, and I also pulled out part of my intercooler tube. Next up is gonna go ahead and remove this air intake, kind of this aluminum part, and it goes into the turbo, and making sure that we're plugging up all the openings to keep dirt out. There are two bolts that are holding on this little aluminum intake section, one here, one there. So we're loosening these guys up. And then if your truck still has the stock configuration for the crankcase vent, there's also going to be a tube that is right underneath here that'll have kind of a worm clamp, or if it's still factory, you'll have to disconnect the clamp there and so that you can take this aluminum part out. In my case, I have an aftermarket crankcase ventilation mod, so it makes it a little bit easier to move around. Now, in my case, I also have a worm clamp here that's holding on this little elbow piece. I'm going to disconnect that so we can get this out of the way. Okay, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the 4 bolts that hold up the air conditioner compressor. So my AC actually works, so we're going to have to be creative about moving this out of the way so that it's not interfering with where we're working. Disconnecting the wires too. Let go to it, set that aside. Alright, I went ahead and got the AC compressor all removed, and I'm supporting it from the hood with a piece of really solid, like 14 gauge wire that I had sitting around. And just trying to keep it out of the way and avoid taking, having to drain the entire AC system. Because what we're trying to do is try to remove this front piece of aluminum like we did on the other side. That's, this machine part holds all these accessories, so we'll get that out of the way so we can access the oil rail end plug that's on the front right here. Now, to remove this accessory mount, there's a series of 4 bolts. So we've got one here, here, and there's another 2 kind of hidden down below. Kind of see one sneaking through the bottom right there, and another one by the power steering pump as well. So one of the bolts that's on here is actually behind this vacuum pump. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the vacuum pump, or at least loosen it up. It's a 13 millimeter or 1/2 inch. There's 3 bolts to hold it on. There's this one hose that goes to it. It shouldn't have any clamp on it because it's part of the vacuum system. Alright, and now we have much better access to the last bolt that is right here. Alright, at this point we can go ahead and access the front oil gallery plug. Alright, and like we did on the other side, I'm only going to break loose this oil gallery plug right now, and then we will drain the oil into the engine block next. Alright, so next thing I'm going to do is we're going to need to remove this valve cover so that we can drain everything out. So I'm going to try to loosen up some of this wiring a little bit so that I can get it out of the way. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and remove the valve cover bolts now so that we can access the oil plugs inside. And of course we're going to want to replace the O-rings inside of these guys as well. Alright, and there's this one that's underneath the crankcase vent. I'm just going to use a regular old wrench to pull that off. You could choose to go ahead and remove these screws as well, but unless you have replacement O-rings, I wouldn't recommend it, because these O-rings tend to get old and they'll most definitely leak when you put it back, if you take it apart and put it back together. Alright, well in this case I might just go ahead and gamble and take this guy off. I actually have new O-rings that I can use in his place. And now I use a regular ratchet to remove this guy. Now the last bolt on here is an absolute pain in the posterior to get to. It's way back here, right between the firewall and the engine. So I'm going to use a little tiny 1/4" drive with a 13mm socket. And it's just barely large enough of a space that I can fit in there. You can't see it, you'll have to definitely feel around. This one's actually slightly worse than the passenger side to access. Alright, got all those bolts removed. I can go ahead and carefully pry this guy up. Pull it out. Alright, it's time to go ahead and replace the front oil gallery plug. Going to do the same thing like we did over on the passenger side, same procedure, make sure it's real clean. And I presume we'll probably have some challenges when we get to the rear. I already have that busted loose using the same tool that we used over on the passenger side, but I'll show you all that guy in a little bit more detail after I get the front done. Alright, so of course before I pulled the valve cover off, I went ahead and loosened up this rear oil drain plug. I'm going to use the same little tool that we made for the passenger side. And I'm going to use a short little adjustable wrench here to continue taking this guy out. And there we go. Got that plug out. Alright, so I went ahead and got everything all put back together, got that back oil gallery plug installed, and probably the main difficulty I had on this guy was similar to what we had over on the passenger side, was being able to actually torque it. And so of course I just used this little tool that I had and a short adjustable wrench, and the torque spec in this guy is 60 foot-pounds for both ends, but all I was able to do is really just give it as much force as I could. This thing's probably like 6 inches long, so that would be like 120 pounds of force. So I pretty much just pushed on it as much as I could, and the Loctite should hold it in place as well. So at this point it's really just a matter of getting everything all put back together. Not really a whole lot to it. I'll show you guys the end results. Alright, so went ahead and got everything all reassembled on the truck. Went ahead and installed the valve cover. And do note that whenever you install all the valve cover bolts, the torque spec on that guy is only about 8 foot-pounds or 97 inch-pounds per the manual. But now I haven't done anything to the truck. Gonna go ahead. The oil rail is completely drained right now, so probably take a little while for it to start, but let's go and give it a shot. Well, folks, that does it for today's video. Hope this helps you out and hopes it helps you to replace the oil gallery plugs on your 7.3 Powerstroke. Thanks for watching.